Yeah.
Welcome to the Into the Wilderness podcast. This week we are going underwater. We're talking mainly about fish.
We are. We're speaking to Chris Conroy, who heads up the Ness Fishery Board. So we're all the way up near Inverness, on the shores of Loch Ness. I think is where he's well, actually, he's at the university campus there, but he roams around the shores of Loch Ness a lot because that's when we were last with him a few weeks back. That's where we were. In fact, we were looking at eels climbing up a waterfall.
We were. I still need to edit the pictures. We have so many different things going on, filming and picture taking, that there's a priority list, and unfortunately the eels have gone to the bottom. And I have actually flicked through them last week because I wanted to edit a few, and then I ended up editing something else. So I'm going to edit some, put some up on our Instagram page and probably our Facebook page as well.
It's a fascinating podcast, and I think it's going to appeal to people. It's actually got very little to do about fishing as such, but a lot to do about aquaculture. And even if you're not someone who fishes, I think you're going to find this fascinating. You'll be amazed, actually, what goes on into managing a system, what is going on in terms of species there, and how complex all the interactions are.
This episode is actually probably good enough if someone was studying aquaculture or
to give them some
something
hindsight.
to give them some information.
Well, you say that, and I remember a family friend of ours with the last fishing podcast that we did, which we had our fishery scientists from our local, the Esk Rivers and Fisheries Trust here, along with the chairman, and we did a podcast, very kind of similar conversation to the one we're having with Chris, and he used that as a basis for one of the papers that he wrote.
And he got an A for it.
And he did. So
yeah,
there
because I remember them asking where he got some of the information from, and he put it from here, and then obviously quoted the scientist, and he got an A for it. For listening to our show. So that shows you that our show can get you an A all the time.
All the time, yeah. So yeah, you're going to be hearing from Chris. We won't say any more about that because it's fascinating.
We're
going to kick straight into it.
Yeah, everything's explained throughout the show. Mm-hmm. And they also talk about the event that they have on in Inverness. I think it's the Salmon Festival. The Salmon Festival,
which is
but
the end of this
all
month.
The details are in the show. So
he's going to talk about it.
Yeah.
We can't tell you who won the podcast from 2 weeks ago because we are recording this the same day.
We're not here.
We're not here.
We're both in different locations.
We are.
Yeah.
And there's going to be some quite interesting stuff come off the places that we're in. So you'll probably see that on social media in the kind of 2 weeks that we're away. So the winner will go up on social media, and we'll contact them. So sorry for not giving you a mention on the podcast. If we remember, I will mention you in 2 weeks' time.
And if anyone's messaged the show or emailed the show and you've not got a response, you should have an auto response. And the reason is because we're here, there, and everywhere, and
signals
and
probably
signals
not
the great. I mean, to be honest, I've been in probably more remote places in the world than Scotland, and I've had less signal in Scotland on the west coast when we've been places, which is ridiculous when you think about it.
I'm definitely not going to have my phone on there because I'm in South Africa. So
yeah, that's a good point. Well, I think now it's I
might have it on. No, but I'll have Wi-Fi, but from time to time. But I'm not going to have my phone on, so no one will be able to get hold of me. I'm kind of going to enjoy the freedom of no phones ringing.
Yeah,
in the mountains.
I might turn mine off for a few days as well. Actually,
that's a good call.
Yeah.
We haven't confirmed this yet, but one of the things I'm going to look at while I'm there is, as a listener to this podcast will know, we've been running wilderness hunts in Scotland, and there might very well be one space left, but maybe not, because in the 2 weeks that
generally we get quite a few emails after we put out a show when we mention something.
Yeah. So at the moment of recording, there's one space left in January, but who knows? That might be filled. But try if you're still interested in that. Shoot us an email. It's first come first serve. But we are going to be looking at because I've been hunting in Africa for almost as long as I can remember, and we are going to be looking at wilderness hunts there.
Yeah.
So I'm going to take some pictures.
Next level stuff.
Yep, going to go to some locations. We've got the right people for it, and hopefully I can bring you some info on that when I come back.
Mm-hmm. Price.
Price, yes. So there is a prize to win, which I don't have in my hand.
You don't need to pick it up.
It is a vintage Hornady reloading sign.
I have one on my wall.
I have one on my wall, above my reloading bench.
So in our office we have one, and it's a really cool... it's like one of those bar signs in a way, like those old vintage bar signs.
It's made of metal.
I actually have another Hornady...
magnet.
No, it's an illuminated Hornady sign above my desk, and we're not going to send it because it's too big for one.
We were supposed to give it away, but it looks too good in the office.
The problem is that where my office is, I look on to... There's a few houses in front of me. I live in the smallest village in the countryside. And it's completely red when I turn it on at night. So it looks like my house is doing unsavory things on the top floor of my house because it illuminates red light throughout the windows. It's that correct red light as well.
I've just noticed, actually, Darrell, looking around the office, there's
a
Hornady magnet
4.
on there. Yeah. And I think you got one on your fridge as well.
Yeah, I do, yeah.
So, yes, you have the chance to win. And while I'm talking about this, Darrell needs to think about how they enter, how you're going to enter a vintage Hornady sign for this week's podcast. And you can enter. It wasn't long enough for you to think, was it?
No, it wasn't really.
Do you know what? I really liked the picture competition, and last week's one wasn't. It was just a simple... Sorry, the 2 weeks ago wasn't. It was just a simple case of telling us somebody who was on the podcast. So let's do another picture one, and we're going to do exactly what we did last time, which was put it to a public vote. And then we won't run a picture competition for 2 episodes or something.
Yeah, it can be of anything like last time. Anything that's outdoor, adventure, dogs. I mean, for example, if you didn't know the winners last time, the person that won was just a fishing rod and sunset, and the runner-up was a pointer on point. Mm-hmm. So that shows you the variation in pictures. But there was amazing pictures. There was loads and loads of pictures that were entered, and we picked top 5, top 4 or 5. So it wasn't even, all we did was kind of filter out a little bit, shortlisted it, and so it was completely down to the public.
By the time this comes out, the grouse season will be well underway, so I'm kind of expecting some grousey pictures.
Yeah, I'm kind of expecting.
Because I will have, by the time this comes out, I will have done my days shooting on grouse, so hopefully I will have put up a couple of pictures of my own.
Maybe some dogs retrieving.
Yeah.
That would be cool.
Just some ideas for you.
Yeah, just some ideas for you. Yeah.
So I think that is it. Don't forget that this podcast, since day one, has been supported by the Scottish Association for Country Sports. If you don't know much about them, they're a shooting and hunting advocacy organisation. They have a website. Just Google the Scottish Association for Country Sports, and you'll be able to find out more about them. Or if you go back through our podcast, you will find a couple that Alex Stoddart, the director, has been on very recently and more historically, and Jules Stoddart as well, who looks after policy. And
you were just saying there about the podcast. It's almost our 2-year birthday.
Is it?
In September. I need to double check. But
we're going to have to do a big prize.
We'll do a big prize, and we'll try and do a special show for our 2 years we've been going now.
Yes. So Darrell mentioned this at the end of the last one, but thank you so much to everybody who downloads, everybody who has told a friend to go and listen, because it makes a huge difference. And the only way that we are able to keep doing this is by having more and more people downloading and listening, so that we can get the support to be able to bring you these podcasts with great people and great information.
Yep, definitely.
So thank you.
Thank you.
And enjoy the show. Chris, welcome to the Into the Wilderness podcast. You are the director of the Ness District Salmon Fishery Board. We met a few months, quite a few months back, about 6 months back for the first time. But most recently, when we were speaking with you, the topic of conversation, which is where I want to start this off, was pink salmon. And it made the news not long after that. Tell me a little bit about what we've been seeing in Scotland in the last few months.
Yeah, well, we've seen unprecedented numbers of pink salmon right around the coast of the UK and Ireland, actually. And also across Europe, there's been many more than usual spotted. I should say that because they have been appearing on our coast since about the 1960s. We think a result of stockings into the Barents and White Sea area of Russia. We think these are stray fish that are reaching our coast. Up until 2011, I think there were 15 recorded catches of these pink salmon. this year on the Ness alone, we've had 6 caught, 7 seen off the coast. The nets off the northeast coast of England have had over 200. Had them in rivers right across Scotland, and as I say, all the way down as far as the Avon on the south coast of England as well. So yeah, we're seeing large numbers of them this year.
Of course, and it's still actually in the news because one was caught only yesterday on the river right next to us.
Right. So, is that the S?
Yeah, on the S, yeah.
Fantastic.
The big question that people were asking over that is it an issue? Are we going to see a problem as a result of the Pacific salmon running into our rivers here?
Well, that is a good question. I think the straight answer at this point is we really don't know. You can look at various elements of their life cycle to sort of try and make an assessment. They spawn earlier than our Atlantic salmon, so there's unlikely to be competition for spawning habitat. If anything, our Atlantic salmon will probably spawn over their reds and do more damage to them than they would here, than they would to our own. The temperatures they require for spawning as well, we're at the upper band of that. As far as I can tell, they need about 9.6 to 14.6 degrees, which most of our rivers in the UK and Scotland are above that at this time of year when they spawn. However, the Ness is currently within that band. It's about 13 degrees, so there is potential there. There's also potential for competition with juvenile salmon. However, the pinks tend to, as soon as they emerge from the gravel in the spring, they tend to start dropping back down to the sea, and they smolt as very, very small fish, whereas our own fish spend 2 or 3 years in fresh water. So, again, there's unlikely to be any significant competition at that level. The only point I can really think of at the moment is where they're feeding at sea and whether there could be competition with our post-smolts, the Atlantic salmon fish going off to feed at sea. Survival's already low at sea, so if there is any crossover in feeding areas, that could be an issue. But at the moment, we just really don't know.
And the thinking is that they've basically followed our Atlantic salmon over from where they're feeding to the east coast of Scotland.
Well, yeah, I mean, basically the pink salmon doesn't have as good a homing capability as our own fish do. I mean, Atlantic salmon do stray to a degree, but pink salmon are known to stray a lot more, so they're not very good at navigating back. So whether they're following our fish in or not, or whether they're just literally just trying to colonise new areas because they've had a good year and they're in high numbers. So again, we don't know at this point. So what we need to do is find out as much information as we can, so we can inform future management actions.
Do you think they'll be tagging them in the future so they can actually follow exactly where they've been, where they're coming from?
I think that would be quite difficult tagging them because, as I said, they drop out at about 30 millimetres long when they go to the sea, and the adults die after spawning. So unless you were to catch them at wherever they were spawning, but at the moment, I think it's too early for that. What they may do is trying to look at the genetics of these fish to establish exactly which populations they're from. So if you took a genetic sample from a fish caught in Scotland, in theory you can match that to fish in Russia or Norway or Finland where these populations have established. But to do that, you would need to get genetic samples from all of the natal rivers. So again, it's a little way down the line, but you know that's a possibility.
But just looking at it, the good news right now is that as far as we're aware, it shouldn't affect our fish in our rivers right now because of all the things you've mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, that's the current thinking is I don't think we need to panic at the moment, but I do think because it's a non-native species, it's not meant to be here, it's unlikely to be a good thing.
Yeah.
So what we need to do is gather as much information as we can about the fish to try and establish, or try and do a risk assessment really and look ahead. But at the moment, there's no major panic because of the reasons stated.
Is this the kind of thing that the government would try and put a bit of funding towards to find out what's actually going on, or do you think they won't be interested?
I'd like to think they would. We've already started a sort of an informal working group. I'm talking to people at the moment from the Environment Agency in England, Inland Fisheries Ireland. We've got representatives from Norway, Finland, Denmark, and further afield. And where I am here today at the Rivers and Lochs Institute at UHI in Inverness. They're looking at various options for projects to look into this. So I'm sure there will be some work done. It's still the early stages. I'm sure there will be some research. Exactly how it's funded at this stage, we don't really know, and we're just trying to discuss what needs to be done as a priority. But I think going forward, you will see some research into it.
Yeah. We know, I read I think it was in the newspaper a couple of days ago, and you just, I think, mentioned it a few minutes ago, that the populations that are already established in Russia and Scandinavia, those populations have done very well this year. They are seeing much more of those established populations, which I guess is probably why we're seeing a greater drift over here than we've seen in previous years. Do we know why they've done so well this year, why the populations are just up, generally speaking?
It could be good survival at sea again. It could just be a change in currents. Ocean currents could have washed them over here. The truth is, we're not totally sure. What we do know is the populations peak every 2 years. They tend to have a 2-year cycle. So if you look back, as I said earlier, 2011 there were only 15 reports from 1960 to 2011. Then there were a number of reports in 2011 when a slight peak. 2015, there was even more of a peak, particularly on the Tyne, and there were fish reported on the Spey in Scotland as well. And then 2 years later is this year, so we seem to be having increasing numbers again. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in 2019. We get elevated numbers again. If so, it suggests that there may be more regular visitors than there currently are. Let's put it that way. So it will be interesting. It will be interesting to see. But it may just be that they've had a particularly good year at sea. It might just be that, and there's excess numbers. And these fish run in huge numbers in Alaska and North America. I mean, in the millions. So when they do well, they do very well.
Actually, for the first time, I was doing some shopping the other day, and I was looking across the canned fish, and I saw pink salmon. I must have seen it a million times before, but never actually clocked it and thought, I know exactly what that is, because obviously we've been talking about it so much. But yeah, you can buy canned pink salmon, which I guess must be brought in from the States, from Canada.
Yeah, I mean, and it's the same with us as well. I've never seen one before. I've heard about them and I've heard about reports, but I've never actually seen one or didn't know anything about it. So it's been a very quick learning curve for everybody, I think. Obviously we're used to just dealing with the Atlantic salmon, so it's interesting.
Just describe them to me, Chris, and also once you've finished explaining exactly what they look like for people who might be fishing and catch one, what is the advice right now with regard to catching them?
So, size-wise, they average about 4 pounds. The ones we've been seeing range from between about 2.5 pounds up to about 5 pounds. The ones we've had here on the Ness. So when they're fresh, they're silver like a Atlantic salmon. They have a more of a, I describe it as a tuna-like shape to them. They're short, stubby-looking fish. They have a very, very spotty tail, oval spots, large oval spots. And they have almost like an olive green colour to the top of the fish, with spots along above the lateral line on them. The most distinguishing feature is the tongue. They have a black tongue, which is very distinctive. They're the key things to really look out for. Males and females are difficult to distinguish when they're fresh run. They look the same. As they mature and go into spawning colours, the females develop a very sort of mottled, greeny, pinky kind of colour to them, and they have almost lines down the side with a very white belly and lower flanks on them. Very distinct. They look completely different than our own fish. And the males develop a very distinctive hump in front of the dorsal fin. Again, same colours, olive green, browny, pink, with this white underbelly. But you wouldn't miss one if you saw one, because they're so different to anything we've got in our waters. And if you catch one, the advice at the moment is to, if you can keep it alive, and that would allow a sort of more closer parasitology or histology check on it. If you can't keep it alive, knock it on the head, and let your local fishery board know so that they can take samples and have a look at the sex of the fish, look at how developed the reproductive organs are, take some tissue samples so we can use it in the future for genetic purposes. And that's the advice at the moment. Retain them and call the fishery board or trust.
Well, I guess we'll just have to wait and see. From what you're saying, we would expect to see less next year and more in 2019.
More
so
again.
we'll just have to see what happens. Aside from pink salmon, what is your day-to-day role within the fishery board?
So my role is I oversee the management of the board. I'm basically the CEO of the fishery board and the clerk of the fishery board as well. So I just manage the day-to-day affairs, manage the team. The board as a whole, we're a medium-sized fishery board in Scotland. We're not one of the big four. We're pretty much smack bang in the middle. Small team, and we're responsible for fisheries monitoring or fisheries science, fisheries management, which is where you apply the science, and fisheries enforcement, which is to basically anti-poaching operations, etc. So in my job, being a smaller board, I tend to be quite hands-on in all aspects of that as well. So it's quite a varied job. You do everything from paperwork and payroll accounts through to actually getting hands-on, catching fish, etc. So it's a very varied and interesting job, actually.
Yeah, I think there was probably, I know that the structure of fisheries boards and trusts has changed in Scotland in recent years, but there was probably a perception in years gone by where the fisheries board, their only focus was to maximise money for the proprietors of those river systems. But they do, I know that from on our own system here and on the Dee and the Spey, there is a huge amount of really great work that goes on behind the scenes that probably a lot of people won't be aware of to help maintain the river system to the highest quality that it is. Maybe you can talk through a couple of those projects that you've got.
Although your Facebook page does show off your projects very well compared to a lot of the other boards.
I would encourage anybody, if they're interested in the discussion that we're having with Chris, to go and check out their Facebook page. It's Ness District Salmon Fisheries Board, isn't it? That's the Facebook page, Chris.
It is, yes. Yeah. Well, Fish the Ness is the tagline
Fish
on it.
the Ness, yeah.
And we'll talk about the films.
We'll talk about your films later, but if you maybe talk through some of the projects, maybe some of the ones that you've been putting up pictures of recently.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth sort of your first point about what the role of the fishery boards is. I think in the past, yes, it was very much seen as representing purely the interests of proprietors. But obviously, there is still a degree of that. The fishery boards are made up of representatives of fishery proprietors from across the district. And the focus now is a lot more on conservation of stocks. Enforcement, for example, these days, I think if you speak to the guys on the ground, most of the work is done to conserve salmon populations. That's our primary goal. Over the years, I think with most rivers, or all rivers across Scotland, there's been a decline in catches. There's been a lot more of a focus on conservation now, so there's been less resources available for enforcement, and more work going towards improving habitat improvements, ensuring that we get maximum smolt escapement from our systems. Here we work, I should say as well, we work very, very closely with the Ness and Beauly Fisheries Trust. We have a very close relationship, and most of the projects we do are joint projects these days. And we also, we're not a wealthy board here, so we deliver a lot of work through partnership as well. So we work with UHI here at the Rivers and Lochs Institute and the SSE. We even work with Marine Harvest. We work with many, many different partners to deliver improvements in our local fish populations. Overall, if you look at our the monitoring work that the trusts do, they do most of the electric fishing and look at the status of the juvenile populations. Most of the nest system is looking pretty healthy, although the catches have decreased. We've seen a long-term decrease in catches, which is pretty much in line with the national picture. We've seen a slight glimmer of hope over the last couple of years where we've seen improvements, but it basically suggests that the freshwater habitat is pretty healthy, and the issue really seems to be at sea. The fish are leaving but not coming back. But that said, there are areas of our catchment that do have issues, and one example is the River Garry. This is the Inverness Garry, not to be confused with the Perthshire Garry. And there has been a massive crash in salmon populations. There's a hydro dam there with a counter in it, and the counts used to be as high as 800 to 900 fish a year. We're now down to a 5-year average of 50 fish. So What we've done is we've looked into the issues. There's a number of complex and interlinked issues in that area, and rather than point the finger at whose fault it is, what we've decided to do is get together with the key players up in that system and look forward rather than looking backwards, and work together to try and resolve the issue. And we've got what's called the Upper Garry Salmon Restoration Project, and partners include UHI, SSE, Marine Harvest, SEPA, and others. And it involves habitat restoration, restoration stocking, and other changes, which I can go to in more detail. But it's a major project.
Yeah, I mean, carry on. I've seen the pictures from it, and it looks, the scale of the project is quite incredible. So just explain exactly what it is that you're doing there.
Yeah, so we've got the populations have decreased to such a degree that we had UHI in 2012 did a study to look at what the issues were and to make recommendations, and they basically recommended that in this particular situation, restoration stocking would be appropriate. There's a lot of debate about whether people should be stocking rivers or not. We need to make the distinction between what we call enhancement stocking, which is where people are stocking to catch more fish, or restoration stocking, where you've got a population that is on its knees basically and needs a bit of help to actually just exist, which is what the Garry is. So there aren't enough adult fish returning there to be able to take the usual approach of taking adults and stripping those fish. So what we're doing instead is we're catching the smolts on the way out, and the salmon smolts obviously are much more numerous, and there are the survival rate at the moment is probably only between 2 and 5% of the population returning. So by taking those fish, if we have any issues with them in a hatchery, which is always a risk, if we were to lose them, it's not going to have any impact on the overall population, because they would have likely not returned anyway. So we're taking a small proportion of the smolts, very small proportion, and we're bringing them on in a hatchery over at Drim Sally, which is the Loch Fisheries board, and we are bringing them on to adults, and those fish are then going to be stripped, and their eggs are going to be introduced into the top of the Garry system. So it's quite a novel approach. It's a bit long-winded, but it's the way we have to do it because of the circumstances on the ground. And in terms of the risks of hatcheries, we have a scientific group that sits. It's a steering group that sits on the project, and it includes detailed genetic analysis of all these fish. So, for example, the fish that we have in the hatchery at the moment are all being tested in the genomics laboratory here in Inverness, and they're looking at whether they are true wild fish, or whether there's any Norwegian influence, or maybe escapes or historical mismanagement or stockings in the past. So we know that they are pure wild fish. We know how closely they are related to each other. So when we come to cross these fish, we can get the best match, so we don't cross siblings with each other, to increase the genetic diversity. At that level of work, I'm not sure if it's been done in Scotland before as a safeguard. And as I say, we have a panel of experts. Everything that we do is approved by them before we do it. So it's really quite pioneering work. It's going to take a while to see the returns. The fish up on the Garry are usually multi-sea winter fish. They're usually 3 freshwater years, 3 sea winters. So if you think about the time it's going to take for these fish to come back and to then propagate, we're probably talking 20 years before we'll see any real benefits. But hopefully I'll still be in the job at that point, and I'll get to see the results.
It's great that yourself and many others have actually gone to the effort of this extremely long-term approach, but it's sad in a way that it's got to the point that this has actually had to happen. But from your work, it could mean the survival of other rivers. If what you've done works, then other people can then follow suit and learn from what you've done.
That's one of the things we're trying to achieve here. Is we're trying to document everything we're doing as well, to see if it can be used in other areas as well. Not just the actual, not just the approaches, but also the partnership approach that we're taking as well. Because, in this day and age of limited resources, the only way to deliver things is in partnership with others. So
yeah, it's that that is key across so many different industries. And it might mean partnering with people and industries that you might not normally see as allies. And we say this quite a lot in the shooting world, and we're seeing a little bit of that in the fisheries world as well. And I think that's great to see. And that's how you, just like you said, that's how we need to be able to move forward, because we can't really change what's happened in the past.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So.
Yeah, an amazingly granular level that you're going to. What is the issue that we normally see being discussed with hatcheries? Because it's one of those, I mean, this is a very specific scenario, and I think for most people it should be able to make sense why you're taking this approach. But it's always the thing that comes up when you talk about recovering a river to the historical numbers. Put a hatchery in. It's one of those things that's mentioned a lot, and it caused a lot of controversy from sort of both sides of the table.
Yeah, it does. I think I find that people are either pro-hatchery or anti-hatchery. There's no in between. When in reality, it is a management tool, and in certain circumstances, it is an appropriate management tool. However, in other circumstances, it certainly isn't. And if we were to look at other areas within the Ness system where we have seen decreased salmon catches or adult catches, the juvenile densities in the river are healthy. So if we were to stop those areas, we would probably need to catch as many adult fish. Sorry, we probably need to retain as many adult fish in the hatchery as are currently caught on an annual basis to make any difference to the numbers. And then by taking those fish out of the system, you're stopping them from naturally spawning. And as soon as you bring anything into a hatchery, you're altering it genetically. Just by putting it into that hatchery environment, you're affecting its ability. The young are affecting their ability to feed naturally, to feed on natural food sources. And this is something we find on the Gary project. It takes a while to get those wild smolts to take a pellet feed, and they have to be hand-fed a mix of wild food, slowly bring the pellets into there. And there's a lot of work that goes into it. And that's the thing. What you end up doing is you're taking fish out of the system and then putting a worse product in at the end of it than you would have got if you left them to do it naturally. So the only time really a hatchery would be appropriate is if you have a population that is in dire straits and is in a real issue. And even before that, you should be looking at habitat restoration options or other options before you even go to that point. But I think the key thing is it's the hatchery is not the be-all or end-all, and I think where it's frowned upon is if you have a relatively healthy population and you stock on top of that to just increase your catches, which can result in lower catches in the long run. As I say, I'm not anti-hatchery. I see there are obviously I'm not, because we've got a hatchery program, but you've got to think about where it's applied and try everything else first, which was what was done on the Gary as well. Other options were tried before we got to this point and didn't work basically. So.
Is some of that sort of mindset change that we're seeing now? It sounds to me like it's more of a knowledge thing. We know more about the fish in our rivers, especially in those early stages before they go to sea, than maybe we knew 50, 60 years ago when there were a lot more hatcheries across Scotland.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think there's a lot more known about the sort of potential impacts of hatcheries, and there's a lot more known about the status of our fish stocks than there used to be. And it's like I say, on the River Ness, for example, we have seen a decrease in certain components of our run on the River Ness, but we were out electric fishing just last week, and we were getting exceptionally high densities of fish. And to put it into perspective, to put it in sort of plain English, we would class on the Ness, we look at salmon fry, which are the fish that are less than a year old, and salmon par, which are the juveniles between 2 and 3 years old, basically. We look at the densities per 100 metres squared. An excellent density of fry is 50 per 100 metres squared. We were getting densities of up to 400 to 500 per 100 metres squared on the Ness.
Crazy.
Wow.
And par, you're looking at a good density is probably about 18 to 20 of par. Obviously, there's less of them survive, so the densities are lower. So you get an excellent density of say 20. We're getting above 60 per 100 metres squared. So that suggests that there isn't an issue with spawning, and there isn't an issue. We don't know what the densities were like in the 60s because there weren't monitored then. So we honestly don't know. But if you compare it to other rivers, the Ness looks very healthy. But yet we are seeing a decline in catches, or we have seen a decline in catches. So that suggests that the problem is at sea. Stocking in the river will not necessarily resolve that, because there isn't very much room left in the river anyway to stock into, because it's already
full. It's already kind of at capacity. It's a really important discussion that I think probably a lot of people won't be aware of what is actually the holding capacity for young salmon in our rivers. And if you're at your maximum capacity, if it's possible to measure that, then you know that the issue, assuming that they are making it to sea, you know that the issue is at sea. And I think there's a general acceptance now that the big issue that we face with Atlantic salmon is happening somewhere out in the big ocean.
That's an even bigger headache.
It is. We have our hands tied because we only have a limited remit and a limited area that we can work in, and limited funding. So what we try and do here on the Ness is our sort of approach is to ensure the system, or the Ness system, is producing as many healthy wild smolts as it possibly can, and hence why we're looking at increasing access to burns that maybe have access issues, or the Gary project where we know there's issues up there. We're just trying to produce as many wild smolts as we possibly can, and I think that's all we can really do at the moment. And that includes protecting them from illegal exploitation as well, protecting adults, just making sure as many adult fish get to the spawning grounds and successfully spawn as possible.
The habitat restoration, which you mentioned, that's something that we've been doing in the trust that I'm on here down in the Esk Rivers and Fisheries area. Just talk a little bit more about the type of habitat restoration that you've been doing. Opening up, one thing that's a fairly easy thing to do, if it's not a case of there's the massive waterfall and you've got to build a pass, is just simply opening up small burns that might have been blocked by fallen trees.
People don't think about that, because it is crazy how far up they go, and the tiny burns that they... you see a fully grown salmon in a burn
way up in the middle of nowhere,
and the burn can only be less than half a metre wide.
Yeah, it's incredible. Yeah. I mean, we have a program every spring prior to the smolt run. Our team go out and clear burns of fallen trees. Not all of them, obviously, because we need woody debris in systems. It's important habitat for par and for adults as well during the spawning time. But we go out and we assess. We know where the key burns are. We go out and assess the burns. And if there's any significant blockages for either smolts leaving or adults coming in, then we'll clear them. Then we have the more sort of the bigger issues, which are things like bridge aprons or culverts where or weirs that the fish struggle to get over. Majority of ours are actually, rather than being completely impassable, they're partial barriers, as we call them. They have less of a priority when you look at from the government or CEPA's level, because they obviously have huge numbers of these issues to address, and any funding they put forward, they have to prioritise. So you have to get the most bang for the buck, basically. But what we're doing locally is, if say, for example, we've got the home weir, the home burn weir, which we're working on at the moment, that structure had a fish pass on it, but it wasn't functioning particularly well. It was put in as part of a flood scheme, and it had degraded, and it wasn't performing very well. So the council had asked whether they could fix it, and through discussions, they're incorporating a new fish pass onto it. That's how we work here. Is we try and get as much benefit as we can on the back of other projects. Again, because resources are an issue. Hopefully that's being built at the moment. I have a site visit on Monday just to make a few fine adjustments to it. But hopefully that will result in more fish running the home burn, which is the only major tributary of the River Ness. So hopefully that's good. We've also got issues with, when we say habitat, it's also about and passage. We've got a project on the Gary again at Gary Dam, and we think there might be an issue with smolts being able to get through the dam. So it has a fish pass or a fish lift for adults to go up, but we think there may be an issue with the smolts getting back out again. So SSE are currently leading a project which we're feeding into to look at putting fish through the turbines rather than through the fish pass. At the moment, the smolts escape through the fish pass and the turbines are screened, but we're going to look at putting them through the turbines. So there's a huge project going on where smolts are going to be put, or small-sized fish are being put through the turbines to look at damage, to look at survival, and we're hopeful that that will significantly improve the numbers of fish escaping. Again, that's being led by SSE with our input. Again, another partnership project. So hopefully that will be have major benefits as well. So that's the kind of thing we're doing here. The actual physical habitat restoration, we're not doing anything specific at the moment, hands-on, restoration type works, because lots of the system is actually in pretty good nick anyway. There are areas that we will look at in future. They're quite large-scale issues that we need to build a case for and build a partnership for, but we will get onto them shortly.
One thing I read a lot about down south, and particularly talking about chalk streams, is the actual fly life and their concern about fly life cycles, and obviously how that feeds into the health of their brown trout populations. But obviously all fish need to eat, and they're eating insects and other items that are floating or get carried into the river. What work is being done, maybe not necessarily in your system, but just generally speaking, about the actual food source within these rivers for salmon, for young salmon pile?
Yeah, we don't really do anything to do with that actually in our area. I know on the Common they haven't been looking at nutrient inputs into upland streams with regards to trout productivity. Par productivity. A lot of our moorland heath and upland streams would at one time been very vegetated over trees, birchwood. Now they're just moorland heath, and there is the debate that there's been a significant loss of nutrients in those areas because you haven't got the leaves going in, you haven't got the nutrient levels for the insects, associated insects. So they are looking at that type of thing. For example, if you get a deer carcass in an area of river, there has been some work to show that if a deer dies, falls in a burn, you'll get increased productivity of par because of the nutrients that go into it. So I think that the answer is that the Common are ahead of the game, but I think more and more we're becoming more aware of that at the moment and potential ways of addressing that. Tree planting isn't always appropriate. It is in some circumstances. A lot of the areas are also managed estates for deer, so you don't want to be blocking that set. You don't want to be blocking migrations of deer while you're planting trees and fencing them. So there's lots of work that needs to be done on the best ways of approaching those issues.
I know it was something that there was ongoing discussions in one of the upper catchments here about tree planting, and the focus was a couple of fold. It was initially for reducing the peaks and troughs of rainfall and how the river came up and down to help reduce downstream flooding. But then the knock-on benefit of that being the potential increase in food source and nutrients by having the sides of the rivers planted where there hadn't been before. But like you said, there's always other things which conflict. In that particular instance, the RSPB didn't want more of the low ground, which was a very wet area, being planted with trees because it had a very high productivity for waders. So that would have been encroaching on an area that waders would have normally been using for feeding and nesting. So yeah, there's a lot of things that you have to think about as a knock-on effect when you're trying to decide what to do. It might be a great thing for one aspect, but not necessarily for another.
Extraordinarily complicated when you start bringing in other wildlife as well. You think about it's the fish, and then you got to bring in all these other wildlife as well that you've got to take account for when you're trying to look after one species.
You look at the Ness system, for example. You have a special area of conservation for salmon on the Morriston, Murray Morriston. You have a special area of conservation for seals and dolphins in the Firth, Murray Firth, and you have a special area, I think it's an SPA, a special protection area for goosanders and mergansers in the Firth as well. So you've got species which interact with each other. They have an impact on each other, but they're all protected to the same level. And as I say, this is why partnership working is so important, to talk to all the various bodies that are involved in it, understand everybody's requirements and look at ways to get the most benefit you can under the legal frameworks. So it is, and any habitat restoration projects is, again, you need to be talking to all the bodies, and you might find that there's areas where we can do tree planting, for example, for salmon, where there are going to be benefits from species such as freshwater pearl mussels. Of course, with the shading, reducing water temperatures. So Yeah, I mean, it is very complicated, and a lot of our time is spent behind the desk dealing with those kind of issues as well. Just trying to make build these cases and make these projects work. People don't usually see that. They only see us on the river. They don't see the work we do behind the scenes. So.
I forgot you've got a very large population of dolphins up your way, don't you?
We do, yeah. There's a very healthy population out in Murray Firth. Yes, yeah. Chattery Point, probably the most filmed dolphins in the UK, I'd say.
Yeah.
Talking about predators, obviously dolphin are predators of salmon. What is the predator interaction that we can control, and the mechanisms that allow you to control those in your river systems?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the best way to control it is to have a good habitat. So that if you have a healthy river with healthy habitat for parr and smolts, for example, then you can have a system where the predation is minimised. We have probably one of the biggest issues on our systems is the sawbill ducks. So Casanders and Mergansers, they do take a lot of fish, and particularly during the smolt period, where the smolt migration, where the fish are passively drifting down the river. You have various pinch points where there's dams or weirs where these fish are very open to predation. You can can get a license to control them from S&H. That involves regular bird counts on your system to look at the numbers, to look at the status of the bird population, together with provision of evidence to show that there is an issue and that these birds are having an impact on your fish populations, which can be quite difficult to prove. But we're doing things like smolt trapping on our system, where we can note the number of bird-marked fish, for example, so we can get an idea of the numbers that are being impacted. And then generally, what happens is you would have a license. It's not about killing everything. It's about trying to deter the bird. It's about deterring the bird. So a lot of it is about scaring. So you would have various different scaring techniques so if they see a person, they fly off. So they're not sitting in one place doing too much damage at any one time. And under certain circumstances, under license, it may be that you shoot the odd bird to reinforce the scaring techniques, because they may get used to you scaring after a while. So if you fire a starting pistol 6 times, they'll get used to it. So then maybe may need to reinforce it.
How long does the application process take, Chris? If you know that you've got an issue in an area and you have to take it to the very top level, which is you're going to have to take 1 or 2 birds out and apply to be able to do that. How long does the process take from you actually submitting the first form or whatever it is that you have to do?
Generally a few months, but it's fishery boards who apply. We've done this for a number of years, so we know what we need to do, and we know what information we need to provide, and we have a good relationship with S&H and the people who determine it. So it doesn't actually take that long, as long as you've got the information. As long as you can provide the required information, then that's fine. If you haven't got an issue and the information isn't there, you won't get a license, because nobody wants to do any damage to these bird populations. We're not in the business of damaging any other species. All we're trying to do is find a medium where you can both species can interact. So yeah, it's quite complicated, but obviously that's what we're here to do. That's what our job is. So we know how to approach the applications.
I probably should have got you to do this somewhere near the start, but some people might not fully appreciate exactly the life cycle of Atlantic salmon and what's involved for them to actually successfully spawn and then return to the salmon that they were born in. Return to the river that they were born in.
Yeah, so that's a difficult question. So I should know this, shouldn't I? Really? So basically, the fish. If we start, it's probably better to start at spawning. Yeah, that's probably the place to start. So if you have adult salmon, you'll have a male and a female, or a female and a number of males, on an area of suitable habitat, which is usually cobble or gravel, say fish-sized cobble or gravel, clean, well-aerated substrate, which is where the habitat suitability comes in. The female will dig a nest with her tail. We call it a red. So she digs a depression in the gravel, sometimes quite deep. If you look at some of the reds on the nest, they can be almost a foot deep. So a significant amount of work goes into it from the female to dig that hole. And then when she's ready, when she's happy with her red, she'll release her eggs, and you'll get numerous males come in and fertilise her eggs as they drop into the depression. As soon as she's finished, she then uses her tail to cover up the depression, and the eggs then incubate. So on the nest system, that will occur anywhere from mid-October through to mid-December. Well, actually, above Loch Ness, the fish spawn mid-October. Below Loch Ness, they spawn. They start spawning in December and run all the way through to sometimes February. That's to do with the water temperature and the impacts of Loch Ness. It's quite a unique system. So the eggs will then incubate until the spring. So April time, the eggs hatch, but they stay under the gravel. The young fish are now called alvins, and they have a yolk sac, or like a lunchbox as we call it, and they stay in the gravel for until they've used all that food in their yolk sac, and then they emerge or swim up. And at that stage, they're about 20 to 30 millimeters long, very, very small fish. They then become called fry, and they'll spend in the nest system anywhere from 2 to 3, maybe 4 years in fresh water as what they call par. When they get to about 120 millimeters long or 12 centimeters long, after about 2 or 3 years in the spring, they then start going through a process of change called smoltification, where their body changes, they start turning silver, and they migrate down to the sea. They shoal up, and they basically head out. And at that point, that is where they're quite vulnerable to any obstructions or any predation, etc. They go out into the coast. Then some of the fish, we think, go to the Norwegian Sea, and some of the fish go as far as Greenland. And we think the ones that go to the Norwegian Sea generally come back after a year at sea, averaging about 4 pounds in weight, so significant growth in that period. The ones from Greenland on the multi-sea winterfish, which can come back well over 20 pounds after 2 or 3 years. The fish then migrate back into the system, and the nest is lucky in the fact it has various components of the salmon population. So we have fresh run returning adults anywhere from November, December, all the way through till October, November time. So we have a run right through the year. The ones that come in from November through till the end of May, we call the spring salmon. The ones that come through from June through to through to September, we call the summer salmon, and then after that, we call them the autumn salmon. The fish run up the rivers, they jump any waterfalls, get back to their area where they spawned, and then the whole cycle starts again. So that's basically a brief life cycle of the salmon.
What is the survival of Atlantic salmon like after this one? We were talking about pink salmon earlier, and you were saying that they pretty much all die. Do they after they're spawned, or is it a very, very high percentage die? Is there any returning fish from pinks?
So the pinks, I believe, they all die. I believe. As I said, we haven't had that much experience in that, but I believe so. Yes.
But not the case with Atlantic salmon.
No, a large proportion do die, but we do have what we call repeat or previous spawners, and we do find those on the nest system. I think they seem to be more prevalent the further north you go, and we have we do a scale sampling program, and basically if you take a scale from a fish, it's like plucking a hair out. It doesn't do the fish any harm, and from that it has growth rings on it like a tree, so we can figure out how old the fish is, how long it's spent in freshwater, how long it's spent at sea, and whether it's spawned before as well. And we've had fish. We usually get 2 or 3 a year in our samples. Our sample size is probably 70 to 100 scales a year, so relatively high proportion. Some of which are spawned they usually spawn once and they're on the way back to spawn for a second time, but we have had fish that are coming to spawn for a third time as well, which is quite interesting. So people do think that they all die, but they don't. The kelts, as they call them, which are the fish that have spawned, will try and migrate back to the sea, and a proportion of them will come back again.
I'm intrigued to know if you can explain in layman's terms how from a scale sample you can tell whether a fish has spawned or not.
So basically when a fish runs into fresh water, it stops feeding. So what it does is it absorbs the nutrients in its body, and it absorbs the scales as well. So you get what's called erosion on the edge of the scale. So if you take a scale from a fish that's fresh into the river, it has no erosion on it. If it's been in for a month, it'll have a small degree of erosion. if you find a fish that has, if you look at a kelt, which is a fish that has spawned, the scale is eroded right back. So when that fish then goes back to the sea and starts growing again, the growth starts on the edge of that erosion. So you'll always have a line of erosion showing on the scale. So you have it's like a rough edge within the scale. So that's how you can tell whether it's spawned before or not, just from that erosion.
Incredible.
Learn something new every day.
You were also talking about electrofishing earlier. A lot of people will have heard electrofishing mentioned, but maybe not. I've been lucky enough to do it a couple of times, actually. We filmed some of it when we made the film on sea trout at Loch Ness. Just explain that process and what it is that you're looking for when you're electrofishing areas.
Yeah, so the main use for it is just to monitor the health of the juvenile salmon populations. That's our key role. So we have a number of sites or index monitoring sites across the Ness system on the various catchments, and we're looking at we're trying to look at how many fry and par are present per 100 metres squared. So we'll section an area off. The electrofishing gear sounds, to people who haven't seen it, it sounds horrific, but what it actually does is it makes the fish swim towards you. It stimulates what's called forced swimming. So it makes the fish swim towards your net so you can scoop them out, and the fish recover within minutes or seconds or minutes. So it doesn't do them any harm. That allows us then to measure the fish, weigh the fish, count the fish, look at what species they are, whether they're trout, they're salmon, take scales so we know how old they are. We can determine a huge amount of information just from that survey. And then it also gives us a density of fry and par each year, so we can then compare year on year that site to see whether there's been any changes. So it might be that you see a major decrease in the number of fry present in that site. And if you look closely at the river, you might find out there's a blockage downstream which prevented the adults from getting up there, and that would be shown in your electrofishing survey. And it also allows us to compare different sites in different parts of the catchment, so we can say, is the River Ness performing better than the River Morriston or the River Garry? And you can also compare it to other river systems as well across Scotland. So that's why we do that. It's one of that and rod catch data are our main assessment tools for the health of the system. We do also have a couple of fish counters as well, which are run by SSE, but we have access to those, and that gives us counts of fish that are migrating up through those dams, and it takes a photo of every single fish as well, so we can gather quite a lot of information from that as well.
We've been talking a lot about salmon, and we haven't really mentioned sea trout. How does the sea trout component of your system vary compared to the salmon? I mean, all the work that you do for young salmon is obviously going to help young sea trout as well, but is it a bit of a different story as to how that population has changed over time on the Ness?
Yeah, I mean, the sea trout populations have crashed significantly, actually. We used to get a run of around we used to have catch returns of around about 3,000 sea trout within our district, and last year we had 90 reported. Now there is a bit of an issue there with whether the fish are being reported or not. I'm pretty sure we're not getting accurate records of what's being caught with regards to sea trout, so it's quite difficult to draw any conclusions from that. However, I think you could say that there haven't recently been as many sea trout returning to our rivers. That said, over the last couple of years, we have seen an increase in catches, particularly on the actual river, on the River Ness in stream, and we have been seeing them in our salmon smolt trapping operations as well. We've been picking up more sea trout smolts as well. They do have different habitat requirements than salmon, subtly different. The main River Ness and our main river systems are more suitable for spawning for salmon, whereas the sea trout and the brown trout tend to spawn more in the lades, the historical mill lades, or the smaller tributaries than the salmon. So most of our electrofishing surveys that are done on main river, we see very few trout, but if you go to the tributaries, you see more. On the neighbouring Bewley, they've had a huge increase in the number of sea trout over the last couple of years as well. So most of our sea trout fishery is actually coastal, so it's people fishing within the Moray Firth rather than the river. And I think that has an impact on the catch returns as well. It's kind of gone out of fashion a little bit, sea trout fishing within rivers. So I think that will have impacted on the catch returns as well. So sea trout are complicated. more work needs to be done actually to establish what's going on with sea trout than currently is happening. I think there's been a major onus on salmon. So I would like to see more work done on sea trout nationally.
I am quite fond of sea trout as a species. They are quite fascinating, and we know across the whole of Scotland, especially if we look at the west coast, which was historically famous for the runs of sea trout, there are a lot of instances now where where it was very prevalent, it is basically non-existent anymore. I want to talk about eels.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we were lucky enough last time we saw you to go and look at what is the start of their migration upstream. Now, eels,
we took some pictures. I haven't edited them yet, but I did flick through them only yesterday, and we do actually have some cracking pictures of the eels.
And you've got some video on the Facebook page. Now, we've just talked about the life cycle of salmon. The life cycle of eels probably it has a big question mark over it because it's not quite as well known as the salmon and sea trout cycle. Tell me a little bit about eels. They are a fascinating creature, and also what's happened to them, because their populations are not what they were even a few decades ago.
No, I must confess, even though I work for a district salmon fishery board, I have a soft spot for eels. They're one of my favourites. I'm not allowed to say they're my favourite species, but they're close to being my favourite species. In a previous life, I used to do quite a lot of work on eels as well. But yeah, eels have an absolutely fascinating life cycle. So eels spawn, they spawn in the Sargasso Sea in South America. So nobody's ever actually seen it, but all the research points to them spawning it's near Bermuda. So what happens is the adults will spawn there, and then the juveniles will drift in. I think they drift in the Gulf Stream over to Europe. So all our fish comes from South America, which is about 5,000 miles if my calculations are correct. It can take up to 3 years for the juveniles to get to our shore, and they go through it. They start off as a sort of leaf-shaped larvae, and they develop during that journey into what is basically a crystal clear glass eel, as they call them, probably about 70 millimeters long as they reach our shores. They then make their way into fresh water, and they pretty quickly turn brown, 70 to 90 millimeters long, little miniature eels, and they distribute themselves throughout the system. So what we were lucky enough to see was on the River Morriston was the elvers trying to negotiate the falls on the Morriston, which they do, and because they don't jump or they don't swim particularly well, they climb around the edge of the falls. So you'll see a line of these things, sometimes in the hundreds, just working their way up the edge of the waterfall, which is quite impressive, particularly when you've got the salmon jumping at the same time.
Yeah, it's amazing.
It's quite an impressive thing to see. Over in recent years, they reckon the population has declined by 80%. I think the class is critically endangered now. I think from what I can see from my colleagues down south in England, there just seems to have been a slight improvement in the elver runs in recent years, but they're still not. They're not in a good way at all. In Scotland, regulations were brought in a few years ago to make it illegal to fish for eels at all. So you can't fish them online or anything without a scientific license, basically. So they're fully protected here. But yeah, they're an amazing species, and I think they give salmon a run for the money with regards to the life cycle and their status as well. So
that is a seriously long way for things to go wrong for them. I guess that's why they probably spawn in very large numbers.
Do we think that is it the general consensus that the issue is at sea, a bit like with salmon, Chris?
Yeah, well, I think there's a number of potential reasons. There are in-river reasons like blockages to habitat, etc., which can cause problems. But I think the main issues, from what I'm led to believe, it could be to do with climate change, changes in the Gulf Stream, given the fact they drift. If you have a slight change in the Gulf Stream, they can end up not reaching where they're meant to reach. Yeah. There are various parasites that they have as well, which can affect the swim bladder, which is another potential cause for it as well. But on the whole, my sort of understanding is it's to do with Atlantic currents are the main impact. So yeah, I mean, you're right. There's so much that can go wrong for them on that journey, and they're so small. It's quite incredible that any of them make it. Really.
Yeah, it is. Nature is amazing.
That's not a Planet Earth. What was the one that they made? Was it the underwater one? I watched it. It's absolutely amazing. Blue Planet. Is it Blue Planet?
Yeah, Blue Planet.
They deserve like an episode in themselves from the Blue Planet, just because their journey is so big that I imagine they encounter a lot on the way.
Can you imagine trying to capture that though, when they're so small, like what Chris was saying?
It's quite amazing, as you say, that people just are not aware of the migrations that our fish species go through. And you could do a whole series on the migration of, you've got salmon and sea trout have different migrations, eels, the lamprey we get as well, the sea lamprey. We had a dead sea lamprey turn up last Saturday on the Ness, which is probably a post-spawning one, which they die after spawning. Again, they're amazing creatures and very rarely see them. People are more interested in these days. There's more footage available, but I've been trying to film them for quite a while and I've not managed to yet. But they're there.
Tell us a bit about sea lamprey, Chris, because I've seen lots of brook lampreys before, which is a different species, but I've never seen a sea lamprey myself, although I've seen the evidence of where they've been attached to salmon.
Yeah, when it's the sea lamprey, the adults are about 1 metre long. They're a jawless fish. They're a prehistoric fish, basically, and they're a parasite, so they attach themselves at sea to things like basking sharks and salmon and other fish species, and basically suck the blood and gnaw away at them. And but they're like salmon. They spawn in fresh water, so they spend most of the time at sea, but they migrate to spawn in fresh water. Apparently, they're meant to spawn, I believe, they come in May June time, and spawn sometime in June July. However, I've got a feeling on the Ness they're later than that because of the difference in temperatures. I've been trying to find them recently and I've not seen any evidence of them spawning, but they're definitely there. What they do is they create a red in the same way as a salmon, although they, rather than strictly just using their tail, they pick up cobbles with their mouth and move them out of the way. And if you ever watch brook lamprey, which are the smaller cousins, they're only 10 centimetres long or so, the brook lamprey, they do the same. They'll just sit and they move the stones out of the way, then they'll give it a quick kick with their tail to move the finer sediment and pull a few more stones out. Then they lay their eggs in there, and eggs hatch relatively quickly. Then the juveniles are called amacetes, and they live in fresh water for 2 or 3 years in silt, and they have no eyes, and they basically create a web at the end of a tunnel, and they feed on bacteria and algae, and then after 2 or 3 years they'll then transform. They call it transformers, which always makes my kids laugh. And they turn silver and they migrate to the sea, basically. So another amazing species which you don't really ever see documented on TV too much.
No, you don't. It's not a very attractive species.
You can go, that was from the dinosaur period.
It looks like it was.
But the thing is, I bet you everybody knows what it is, because it is, like you said, it's the typical fish you see hanging off the basking sharks or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
The brook lampreys, do they have is their cycle slightly different? Because although I've seen them, I don't really know.
Yeah, they don't. They basically transform into an adult, and they don't feed. They spawn and then they die. So they don't really do quite as much as the sea lamprey or the river lamprey. The river lamprey also migrates to sea, but it tends to hang around in the coastal areas, and it's smaller than a sea lamprey. So there's 3 species in the UK. And in the Ness so far, I've only seen evidence of the brook lamprey and the sea lamprey, although the river lamprey could well be present as well. But,
are we going to talk about the filming?
I was just going to say, before we wrap up, I want to talk about the filming that you've been doing. As we mentioned earlier, right at the start, you need to go and check out your Facebook page because the footage is fantastic. But tell me about starting that process and the things that you've captured so far. Yeah,
well, it started by me getting a GoPro, basically, and just trying to capture fish spawning the last spawning season, and it kind of developed into 4 GoPros and a lot of filming. But there's a number of reasons we're doing it. One of the key reasons initially was to look at the spawning periods on the Ness. A lot of our spawning is in Main River, and the fish are very difficult to spot. So we know they're spawning, but we don't know exactly when. You see fish chasing each other, but you don't know exactly when they're actually laying their eggs. So we've been last spawning season. We monitored various tributaries of Loch Ness and then the Main River Ness, and we determined that what we anecdotally knew, but we managed to prove that there's a massive difference in spawning time between the upper system above Loch Ness and the lower system below Loch Ness, which is very useful. Now, you might ask why that information is useful, but if we are being consulted on a planning application or a development application, such as new bridges across the River Ness, it gives us more information, more evidence for having protected periods where they can't work or where they have to do certain things to mitigate impacts. So it's actually very important information that we're collecting. We don't have a fish counter on the lower system, so this is our only window into that world. A byproduct of it has been Facebook as well. And what we like to do on the Ness is we like to be as open and transparent as we possibly can be. We find if we don't tell people what we're doing, people make it up and they think we're trying to hide stuff, which we're not. We like to be as open as possible. So we take any footage. If we get a good bit of footage off, we'll stick it on Facebook, and it seems to people seem to like it. People have enjoyed it. We've continued doing it now into the actual run we've got at the moment. So we're capturing the fresh fish, coming into the system, and that's given us information on the state of tide that the fish are running, how they're running, which bits of the river they're using, whether they're using the margins or they're running at the centre of the river. It's interesting to see the numbers that are running and comparing that to what people have caught on the day or what the gillies' perspectives are, how many fish have come through the system. What we're finding at the moment is there's a constant stream of fish running through the Ness, and again, part of our job is promoting the Ness system for angling. The angling is very important to the local economy. It's important to what we do. So we find if we show people that the fish running, it encourages people to.
I'll bet it does. It's made me think I should pack up my fishing rod and head to the Ness with all the footage I've seen of salmon.
But these cameras that you told us last time, they're all donated. So it was either your camera, another colleague's, and they were donated to you. And this was just off your own back starting to film.
Yeah, so we're not, as I say, we're not a rich board by any means, and we've got better stuff to put our money into, quite honestly. So this is a couple of them are mine. Someone kindly donated one to us as well, and one of the biologists has lent us another one of the biologists from the trust. And the amount of resource that it takes to do is actually very little as well, because we've got a knowledge of the system. We speak to the gillies, we know where the fish are, and we literally just deploy the cameras and leave them. As we're speaking now, I've got 2 sets of cameras out. They're doing the work while I'm getting on talking to you guys, and then when we've finished, I'll go and collect them and download the information. And they only run for 2 hours, so they're not. Some people have said, I've only seen 2 fish go past today on your film, but that's not necessarily. It's not a quantitative count, but 2 fish in 2 hours on a very small field. You guys will know that you only get about 5 or 6 foot range on these things as well. The Ness is 80 meters wide.
Yeah, exactly.
You get 2 fish is pretty sure suggests there's quite a few fish running through. So yeah, it's interesting. What we'd like to do is put it all together, and we've basically got pretty much every part of the salmon's life cycle on film now in the Ness, and we want to put it together and make an educational film from it, just so people can learn a little bit more. So and actually using our own fish as well. So we'll get around to doing that at some stage.
You must have one of the best underwater documented rivers in the UK now.
I would have thought so.
I don't know. I've never really thought of it that way.
I've never seen any footage.
I'm not aware of it. Not over such a long period of time. What about, you must be learning a little bit about the habits and nature of the fish watching. I know you had that brilliant bit of footage of the little par who was holding his territory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The par are amazing, because this is the other thing. You see the number of par you see as well is quite astonishing. If you put a camera in certain areas, you just, in one field of view, I think I had like 15 par, but if they cross each other's territory, they start attacking each other. They're very aggressive. So you'll see them, and if you look into the research, there's various levels of attack. There's like false charges, and then there's nips on dorsal fins, etc. But you can see all of that happening just on the cameras. It's quite amazing. You can see spawning interactions is incredible, seeing the way the fish behave. The quivering, I've never actually seen the quivering on a male salmon before when he's caught in the female, the quiver shape, and you wouldn't see that from above the surface. You just wouldn't get that. And how desperate they are. The males are at the end of the season. There's one particular clip with the male getting quite amorous with the camera stand. The males have gone. The male kelps were still hanging around. And you just feel sorry for the fish.
He wants to do his job and go home.
Exactly, but they obviously hang around after the females have left. But and also looking at, we had one interesting fish on the River Ness, which was a hen fish. And one thing we find is the fish tend to, once they're going to spawn, they hang around the same area. So you'll see the same fish if you're filming every day for a week, you'll see the same fish every day. I was a female with an adipose fin clip, where someone would obviously clip the adipose fin, and that's done with hatchery reared fish or sometimes with smolt tracking operations. But we don't clip any of our fish. So this was a fish in the River Ness, a female, a hen salmon. We watched her one day, she was full of eggs. The next day she was half spawned. The next day she was fully spawned. And where'd she come from? She could have come from the Common where they clip fish. She could have come from the Spey. But just by having a camera in there, we would never have known that. And that's a story in itself, because people think salmon don't stray, but Atlantic salmon don't stray, but clearly they do. That level of information is very interesting as well. So.
You also had a pike.
I was just going to say that.
I love that video.
It's the one species we haven't talked about, but that is probably one of my, as much as I love Atlantic salmon, that was probably one of my favourite bits of footage that you've had, because of just the nature of the way that the pike moves and that really slow stalking motion. If you've never seen that before, you wouldn't know that that's how, even if you fish for them, and which I've done plenty of it, I didn't really appreciate exactly how they stalk their prey.
It's incredible. Yeah, the pike are amazing. That particular footage is that they're stalking minnows that are in there. There's a lot of wood in that area. There's a lot of brash on the bed of the loch. It's in a loch, and there's a number of they're jack pike, or pencil pike as we call them, a very small pike, but they're just amazing to see the behaviour. They're one of the most interesting ones are eels, though, because we dropped a dead fish, a dead sardine next to the camera in that location to see whether a larger pike would come and take it. And within minutes, we had a pack of eels that arrived. And we've literally, from all angles, they're obviously homed in on the smell and just started taking it to pieces, which is you would never have known they were there otherwise, but they just homed in.
Amazing. Absolutely fascinating. Chris, we're gonna wrap up because I don't want to take too much more of your time. But there's a big festival happening up in your neck of the woods. Just tell people about it and how they can go and see events that are going on. Because I know there's some films being shown, and there's it's a whole festival celebrating salmon.
Yeah, so it's called Scotland Salmon Festival. It's a collaborative project being led by the University of the Highlands and Islands, but with partners ranging from Atlantic Salmon Trust, ourselves, Marine Harvest, and a number of other organisations are involved in it. It runs from the 29th of August to the 2nd of September. There's a series of evening lectures at Eden Court Theatre and a film night showing the latest salmon-related films. There's a 2-day international salmon conference looking at salmon at sea and the issues with salmon at sea. There's speakers coming from all over the world to talk there, and that's here at UHI. And there's also an international spey casting competition. I think there's 32 competitors coming from all over the world, basically to replicate the casting competitions used to have on the Ness in the old days, where the casting competition was so the distance casting, spey casting record was set. So it's worth coming along. It's the second event. The first event was slightly smaller. It's grown. It's going to be a big event. There's going to be on the 1st and 2nd of September, there's a fair at Bucks Park in Inverness. There'll be displays in conjunction with the casting competition. So come along. I think everyone will enjoy it. You may learn a bit more about salmon. You'll meet a few like-minded people, and everyone's welcome.
Brilliant. Chris, it's been a pleasure to have you on. Hopefully we will see you in person again very soon when we're up in your neck of the woods. I think
I've learned something today. I've actually learned quite a bit today.
I've learned something, and I'm sure that our listeners will have learned something after hearing you speak today. So thanks very much for taking the time out.
Excellent. No problem.
Well, I hope you enjoyed the show. Largely underwater, but largely enjoyable. That's where I enjoy spending my time, looking at fish, being in the ocean, and we need to speak to Chris again when we get more information.
Well, we might actually, we're not sure if we're going to have the time, but we might very well go up to the Salmon Festival that he was talking about and maybe grab some interviews with him again. And then there's a lot of leaders in their field speaking at that event. So we're going to try if we can steal some time to go up and bring you something from there.
Yeah, no, it's great to hear the work that's going on, not just with them. It'll be going across the country. Yeah. And I think some actually encouraging news of the health of our rivers. Unfortunately, discouraging news on what's happening at sea, but everybody knows that there is a problem at sea. and it needs to be addressed somehow.
So first got to understand what it is exactly.
Yeah, I know.
That is the big question mark.
I mean, I have a theory, but...
Are you going to share that theory?
Oh, it's just overfishing.
Well, yeah, I think there probably is more to it than that. I think it's a combination of that and also their food sources.
Food sources, I think plastics in the ocean, fishing grounds, the netting, and then, but I mean, there'll be like kind of was explained, the ecosystem is huge. So if one particular species is doing better than the others because of something that we've changed, the knock-on effect is huge. I mean, for example, if dolphins have done particularly well and they're breeding in large numbers, they could have a massive effect on salmon population because they do hunt them. That's just an example. I'm not saying that that's the problem at all. I just made that up. But I'm just giving a theory.
Don't hate the dolphins.
Yeah, don't hate. I think they're quite cute. When I lived in Australia, I worked in a place. I can't remember the name of the place. You'll know it if you've been there in Western Australia. I was working there for 3 weeks. I can't remember it. And they have 200 dolphins in the harbour there, and you can go on tours. And I remember when I was like 10 years old, I actually went on one of the tours. And then eventually, when I was an adult, I managed to go there and work there, and I was there for 3 weeks. And every single day the dolphins would come and play with me, and the calves would come and play, and it brought me a bit of joy because I knew that there was generally not sharks about if there was a massive pod of dolphins as well. But yeah, dolphins are cool. I like them.
I can't tell you what you're going to be hearing in 2 weeks, but hopefully it's going to be something from Africa. As I haven't recorded it yet, I'm not entirely sure what I'm going to get, but I'm hopefully going to get some stuff with a few people who are really knowledgeable in certain aspects of hunting and conservation. And I think what I'm going to do, but I'm going to see how it turns out, is me and my good mate Dia van der Lange, who I'm going to be hunting with up in the mountains, are going to sit around the campfire with the podcast gear on, with a drink in our hand, and talk.
As long as you get the crickets.
We're going to get crickets, and it's kind of winter there, so I don't know if you will get crickets up there in the mountains. It might be too cold. But you're going to hear fire crackling, you're going to hear ice and glass and brandy being drunk. And it should be interesting. We'll see. Hopefully it is something that we can actually probably put out there, but we'll see where it goes.
Yep. Well, until next time.